All right, good morning everyone and welcome to the second PAYS webinar series. Today we're going to be looking at enhancing your data IQ, advanced techniques to help you tell your prevention story. I am Elizabeth Eckley-Winder. I am the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator here at the Epicenter. I am joined today by Phyllis Law, my colleague who will be helping to monitor questions on the online forum. In addition to that, I have Aaron Smith and Patrick North. So they will also be helping me with the technology and also monitoring questions. As you have questions, please feel free to go ahead and post them and we will get to them right away. Just to let you know, today's meeting is going to be recorded. The full presentation as well as the PowerPoint slides will be available on the Epicenter website at the close of this series at the end of September. Also, when the meeting has ended, I strongly encourage you to take a moment to just fill out a brief survey that will launch in your web browser. I personally greatly appreciate your feedback as it will help us to improve the webinars in the future and also be able to help us serve you better. So the survey once again shall only take a few moments to complete, and given the nature that we're talking about data today, I imagine you guys are all chomping at the bit to participate. So finally, we know that some of you in attendance today may have heard about this seminar from a colleague. If you're not currently getting emails from the Epicenter directly and you would like to go ahead and do so and join our series, we'd love to add you to our mailing list. So whether or not you choose to fill out the survey, you will be able to use the web page that pops up to share your email address with us. Excellent. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So to get started, this is just a friendly reminder that we have a four-part series currently going on. We were kind and lucky enough to have Jeff Colchin from PCCD and my colleague Phyllis Law go ahead and do the first seminar last Friday regarding an introduction to the PAYS and also documenting any changes on the 2015 report. Today we'll be enhancing your data analysis, and you'll see the September 23rd and the September 30th dates coming up here. We encourage you to join us for those. So, given the fact that the first webinar really talked about and dug into the idea of the introduction to the report, really getting you familiar with the format, and also kind of an outline of what to expect when you look through your report, in addition to those 2015 changes, that really did serve as a great platform to launch today's conversation regarding digging a little deeper into your PAYS. So in order to provide helpful suggestions to increase the depth of your PAYS analysis, we're going to be looking specifically at two topics today. The first is the Crosstabs online tool, and the second is cut points. My hope is that by the end of this, having a greater understanding of these two methodological topics will not only allow you to increase your quality of PAYS analysis, meaning to dig a little deeper, but also provide you with support in telling your local prevention story in the best way you possibly can. So for those who are actively participating today, I want to point out two takeaways I really would like you to have by the end of this session. The first is that I really hope you're able to understand and explain the Pennsylvania Youth Survey Crosstabs feature. The second is I hope that you'll be able to recognize and understand the cut point methodology and its presence in your report. So one thing we've really made a priority here, the CTC team here at EPIS, along with Roger Spa, our data manager, has really been working the last year and a half to 2 years to support coalitions in telling their best local prevention story. A lot of times we get caught up in the work that we do and we're so busy doing it that we forget to document or track or really piece our work in terms of the outcomes we're creating for youth and families in our communities. So part of our initiative and part of our efforts have been, we really want to help coalitions be able to tell that story. But to do that, you need to really be able to understand the nuances of your data. You also really need to be able to take advantage of all of those tools like the Crosstabs online tool to help you get to those outcomes that you most desire. So I like to think of it in terms of long division and a calculator. So we're really fortunate that once very complicated data techniques, such as long division, to be able to do that analysis has been much easier to obtain. So as you know, long division can be done by a calculator now, and many choose that interface because it's a lot easier to use, and it also saves time, one of our most valuable resources. The same can be said for trying to understand the relationship between the Pennsylvania Youth Survey variables, right? So you can go ahead and hire an external evaluator. You have the option to pay costly software, right? Or you have the ability to go online through the support of PCCD and Bach-Harrison and generate these relationships between the variables or the questions you're most interested in. So like the calculator, it is much easier and more accessible interface to use these online tools provided for us on the site. So let's go ahead and jump into the Crosstabs online tool. So based on objective number 1, which was to get participants to understand a little bit more about the Crosstabs and how you can use it, this section we're going to do 3 primary things. The first is we're going to discuss what is the Crosstabs online tool, right? What is it? What is its function? We're also going to talk about how do you locate the Crosstabs online tool. And lastly, we're going to follow up with how can it help you make meaning from your PAYS data, right? The PAYS is really good at telling you the what is happening, the why it is happening, but it's really our local practitioners and folks who utilize this data to really be able to be those meaning makers and allow those things to emerge. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. So first, to get us started, what is a Crosstabs online tool? Okay. Crosstabs online tool really does allow you to examine your responses to one variable on the PAYS relative to another. So when I use the term variable, really what I'm talking about are questions. So as a practitioner, you might be looking at your report and you might say, oh, well, this is really interesting. I wonder if parents who have certain attitudes that is somehow related or associated with the behavior of their young people. You may decide that you want to take a closer look at that, those 2 questions. The Crosstabs online tool will allow you to do that. So I want to talk a little bit first about how do you access it, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into how do you make meaning from it. So I've actually chosen to document this process on the slide instead of taking you to the site so that you have a documented step-by-step support guide to help you access what you need. I do recommend, however, either after this is over or if you would like to follow along while I'm doing this and documenting this for you, you're welcome to bring up the website you see listed in number 1 here, the bachharrison.com/PAYS web tool. You're welcome to bring that up in a separate screen and follow along as we go. So to get started, you'll see that I just mentioned first you need to visit the Bach-Harrison website. The PAYS online tool and its associated web resources are located on the Bach-Harrison website. Okay, you're going to go under the Viewing Data heading and click Get Started. From there, you'll start to see prompts related to Crosstabs. You'll want to go ahead and click that. Now, following those steps, this is what your interface will look like. You'll be able to bring up. The first thing that I want to draw your attention to is the numerous resources that have been provided as you walk through this Crosstabs process. The first you'll see I have highlighted here on the website is the How to Use Crosstabs button. So on your screen that I'm sharing with you now is the Using PAYS web tool for running item crosstabs. And once again, just to remind you, the items are relative to questions asked in the report. So you'll see here that you're actually able to have a little narrative regarding the crosstabs, right? And then you're also going to have the ability to see a little bit of narration later on regarding what that narrative will actually look like for you. And so that will help you figure out, how do I make that meaning? So if you scroll down here, which we'll give an example of this shortly, you'll see the questions, although documented from 2013, it will give you an idea of what to expect once we dig in a little deeper. But you'll also start to begin to see the narrative located below. And in the narrative, that's where the analysis starts to come from. And we'll practice flexing those muscles here in a minute. So I also wanted to show you another tool that's available for you as well. And that's the PAYS question reference. So instead of having to get your PAYS report out and digging through the different questions to see what might be of interest and help you meet your coalition's needs to dig deeper, they have actually itemized this for us in a really lovely way. So I am bringing up on your screen a copy of the 2015 PAYS questions. What's nice about this, and if you're going to be doing a lot of cross-tabbing, I encourage you to print this out and have it in front of you as you start to dig into your analysis, especially with your work groups. This is a very helpful resource. So if you kind of zoom through here, you're going to start to see where all the questions in the PAYS that are asked of students are outlined for you. This is also a wonderful resource. Now, on the slide, I want to point out two things. The first is, as you can see, it says state or county. The crosstabs is not available for local school district reporting. It is only available to run at a county level or a state level. Okay? The other thing I want to point out to you is I want to go ahead and do a crosstabs so that we can start looking at it and start figuring out what meaning we can make from it. So based on some of the things that we're hearing from around the state as we go to meetings and we work with our regional folks, we're starting to see a real interest in this idea between parent perceptions and parents' attitudes towards substances and actual use among young people. So to provide an example today, one of the things I wanted to do was bring up question B23D, which asks, how wrong do your parents feel it is for you to drink alcohol regularly? Now, this specific question does reference beer, wine, and hard liquor, but because it's so long, it's not captured in that first question box. Now, question 2 I thought would be interesting based on the commentary we've received across the state is to ask then a little bit about youth use. So in order to do that, I am going to be comparing and cross-tabbing question 1 about parents' perceptions and attitudes related to question 2, which is how many times in the past 30 days have you had beer, wine, or hard liquor? These two questions might reference something that your coalition or your agency or organization might be interested in digging a little deeper so that you too can start to target some of your programming and initiatives. So let's go ahead and take a look at this next slide. So whenever you run the crosstabs or the trying to determine the association between these two questions, first thing I want to point out to you is where the questions are situated within the graph. This may not seem at first like an imperative thing or an intuitive thing to need to know, but the ordering of your questions greatly influences the responses or the connections made between the two questions. So you'll see question 1, the how wrong do parents feel it would be, question is located on the left. Whereas on the top right-hand side, you'll see question 2, or the comparison question, which states how many times in the past 30 days have you had beer, wine, or hard liquor. So one of the things besides placement that's incredibly important in your questions because of the meaning you're going to make, it's really interesting when you start to crosstab these, to really start to think about, okay, here's what it's telling me. Now, what does that mean in relation to our prevention work? So as you'll see stated again, for those that may have been hard to see on the PowerPoint, these were the two questions that we're referencing. This, once you run the crosstabs, is one way to be thinking about the output of information you just gathered. So you'll see that I've indicated some arrows which show the direction of the relationship. Okay, so let me give you an example. So for those parents who feel it would be wrong, very wrong, for their child to drink regularly, they have lower incidences of drinking. You'll see 79.3% have 0 occasions reported. So that tells us that there's some association between expectations of parents and drinking behavior. Now, conversely, if we flip that, we see parents who feel as though drinking is not wrong at all, or whose students feel as though their parents feel like it's not wrong. Maybe there's been expectations, that haven't been provided, but they tend to drink more frequently and more regularly than those that feel that would be very wrong. And so you see these directional relationships kind of accentuated graphically here. And I think that that is really helpful, because as you meet with your data groups and you present this information to your larger board or your key leaders or your organization, you really need to be able to dig deeper and talk through, what does this mean? It's one thing to have a chart and be able to show that, but it really is personal to be able to make those relationships and really be able to talk about how things are associated once you run those crosstabs. Now, again, I just want to keep in mind that these are county level data and state level data. Those are your options. In this case, we ran this statewide. So we have a much larger sample or group of people to be able to look at and actually be able to figure out their associated behaviors. So I talked about this, and I'll briefly mention this again, that only you can make the meaning. A lot of times I see in private evaluation, people get evaluations done and then the meaning is made for them and then brought to them. And although that's very helpful to a lot of folks, sometimes you don't necessarily have the same level of ownership or buy-in to the process. So being able to have this hands-on tool that not only you can use, but you can share with those folks on your committee or those folks who are helping you with your process, your data analysis process, allows everyone to have a bit of buy-in and a greater understanding of the real depth of the PAYS data. So having such a rich data source is fantastic, but having tools that can help enhance your ability to dig even deeper is also a valuable asset for an organization. So just to recount, one of the ways to look at the meaning made, I showed you a geographic visual of how you can do that for our more visual learners. So for our more auditory learners, one thing to think about is that if you broke down that same chart in a narrative, you would be thinking about it as the more wrong parents feel it would be for their children to drink, for example, beer, wine, and hard liquor, the less likely their children are to have consumed these substances at a high rate in the past 30 days. Conversely, those parents who do not feel that drinking beer, wine, and or hard liquor is wrong, the more likely to have children who drink at a higher rate during the past 30 days. So what I find interesting about this is by digging deeper into this PAYS data, we were actually able to confirm theoretically what we believe to be true, and that was those parents who talk to their children more often about substance use and abuse and set their expectations are less likely to encourage use or have use result. Now, what is interesting is had we chose some other questions to examine, we may have determined that it demystified some of the theory or the logic that we had. And so it really does allow us to dig deeper. And in order to use this, you make meaning from it. And then the next step is you need to then use this. So when you dig deeper into this data, once you find and you make meaning from those results, you then have to figure out, now how do I incorporate this in my action plan? Or how do I incorporate this with the programs or the activities or initiatives that we've selected? And so that it's really a purposeful investigation of what the PAYS is telling you. Now, we won't be doing these today, but something I want you to think about, and I really want you to spend some time on, whether it's once these presentations are posted at the end of the month, or even after this presentation today, if you have a couple minutes, I really want you to spend some time reflecting on, now that you've done, a lot of you have done your initial scan of the PAYS, I really want you to be thinking about what potential value do you see in crosstabbing based on your coalition's prevention efforts? So this is a part of a two-part question, really. So number one, what has emerged in your analysis thus far that's worth digging deeper and exploring? And then in addition to that, how could you then potentially use that to help your coalition tell a better local prevention story? And when I use the terms and kind of the phrase local prevention story, I really mean, how do you work from a defensible problem like underage drinking or high risk factors that you're concerned about or protective factors that you're trying to increase, and use this strategy and this Crosstabs web tool to really be able to get people to understand all the investment in the programs and the activities and strategies you have, because you're working towards that light at the end of the tunnel, or that bright spot where you decrease underage drinking, or you reduce the impact of a certain risk factor for youth in your community. So really thinking about, how can I use this Crosstabs to truly inform my coalition's prevention efforts? And additionally, just think about what contributions in the future could this crosstab feature provide you in terms of your PAYS analysis. And as I previously mentioned, having these tools are great, but I think sharing these tools are even better. The more you can share these tools with the folks in your committees or in your organizations that are data savvy, that are writing grants, that are doing things where they could truly benefit from this deeper dive, the better off you'll be, because not only will you increase the level of understanding of the PAYS throughout your organization, but you'll also get people thinking at a deeper level when analyzing their PAYS, which is ultimately what we want. Now, I want to take a little bit of time here. We just discussed, we went through, and just kind of to recap, we went through and we were able to define what is a crosstab, okay, meaning the questions that you're able to find an association through with the online tool. We were also able to talk about how do you find it, right? And so that was on the Bach-Harrison website. The PAYS web tool or Crosstabs tool is housed there. And from there you have multiple features such as the how to use access guide and also the question reference guide, which can help you. And then we talked about how does one make meaning from this analysis. And I think that by using some examples, we were able to talk about what that looks like. Now we want to talk a little bit about cut point methodology. Now, I know you're hearing the title and you may be running and screaming, but don't, because I think we can go ahead and make this very easy to understand. Now, cut points all began with some work done by Michael Arthur and colleagues, including Hawkins and Catalano in 2007. So this effort to identify a cut point, which I'll define for you here shortly, really was based on this idea of every student or every youth experiences some average or normal, and I say that in quotes, which you can't currently see, level of risk within their life. So there's this average level of risk that every person faces. But to determine what this quote unquote average level of risk looked like, this methodology had to be created. So in order to identify that, you see here that there was research done in 2007 on approximately 84,000 students from 6 states. And so what they found was that they were able to determine what that average or that cut point was that indicated those below it being the average level of risk and those above that point identified being more at risk. Now, my colleague likes to think of this in a very visual way, and I'd like to share that with you. So let's say, for instance, that you added up all 84,000 of those student responses from lowest to highest, and you went in and you found the middle number. Okay, so out of that entire list, you found the number that landed flat in the middle. And all of those students below that number in the middle were considered at average risk, and all of those students above that average level, also known as the cut point, were considered at risk. Okay? What is interesting about this is the original research was done with 6 states to find that number. Luckily, because of our strong relationship and support from PCCD and Bach-Harrison, we are now able to have Bach-Harrison look at our 11 states that they currently serve, meaning Pennsylvania, Arizona, Florida, Iowa, and so forth. You're able to look at those states, which is a pretty good geographic representation across the nation when it comes to the different variables that influence the ability to look at something in depth. When you look at that analysis from those 11 states, so instead of 84,000 students, we have a much larger volume of students. So whenever you add those up and you look at the cut point to determine what's at risk, that then becomes present around page 90 in our reports with our risk factor profiles. Okay, so just to define what are cut points, very briefly, I gave you the basic terminology around it, but a cut point is truly defined as a level of response that is at or above that quote-unquote average or normal level of risk, and conversely, those below are somewhat standard or more normal. Now, rather than randomly determining whether a youth may be at risk or protected, this statistical methodology of cut points was truly used to help determine what was outside of the normal range. Now, some of you might be asking, why is it really important to understand who is outside that normal range? Well, part of it stems from the fact that you want to be able to target your programs and initiatives to those students or those youth who are experiencing higher than normal levels of risk. So what you'll see here in the next slide is that when you are provided a percentage on your risk factor scale, which I will show you one here shortly, you'll know that this percent that is representing a youth population in your community that's at greater risk and potentially lower protection than the national cut point level. So many people see these levels of risk, and this is one of the ways that they guide their prevention efforts moving forward. And so by being able to organize these strategies, initiatives, and programs in a very thoughtful way, the ultimate goal is to really then see a strategic approach to prevention that's going to encourage you to get the outcomes you most desire, which could be decreases in things like these higher than average risk factors. Now, one note to keep in mind as we could go through this is that not all risk for every grade is the same. So as 6th and 8th graders, 5 or more risk factors as outlined by the PAYS and as discussed in the previous webinar, indicates high risk, right? 10th and 12th grade, 7 or more risk factors that a youth faces puts them at higher risk for problem behaviors. Now, total protection is 3 or more protective factors, regardless of grade. Because what research has told us is that the more protection a child or a youth experiences in their life, the lower risk or the lower influence of those risks that are being felt will greatly impact them. So whenever we work with our sites, the one thing that we tell folks is, yes, we do an outcomes-based and outcomes-focused approach to prevention, but that's a two-pronged approach. You not only need to be thinking about what risks are my youth facing and making sure that we're able to lower those most prioritized risk, but also really be able to look at those protection numbers that we have. So what are we doing really well? What do we need to enhance? Because you can't talk about risk without talking about protection. And so a lot of times I will pose to my community to answer a question, so what's most important, prioritizing risk or prioritizing protection? And the answer truly becomes, it's a bit of a trick question, but you have to do both, because you can't talk about one without the other, because protection truly is that wonderful thing that buffers our children from youth concerns later on. Now let's take a closer look at a risk and protective factor profile. I have borrowed this. This is not statewide, this is countywide, because one of the upcoming webinars will be focused on the statewide data. But I'm looking here at Center County Youth Survey data. And as you know, Center County, many of you may not, there's multiple school districts, so this is quite the hybrid here. But what you start to see is that in this chart, I always encourage people to not only look at the highest numbers, but see what may be trending the most quickly, where there may have been gaps from previous implementations, and so forth. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and look at 2 of the numbers that appear to be the highest risk associated with the Center County PAYS. So the first one you'll note is 42%. So if you have a 42%, which I've identified here, you'll see the 42% here. So let's go back. So if you have identified the 42% as an area of concern for perceived risk of drug use, the way to think about this and the way to articulate this is 42% of students are at risk for problem behaviors associated with perceived risk of drug use. Now, as many of us know through our work through the PAYS, every risk factor has a set of problem behaviors associated with that risk factor. So in many cases, it can range from things like delinquency, truancy, poor academic performance potentially, but primarily things like teen pregnancy and substance use and abuse. There's a whole host. And the relationship between those risk factors and those problem behaviors, in order to be a problem behavior associated with that risk factor, there has to be at least 2 longitudinal quasi-experimental design studies showing that connection between the behavior and the risk factor. So many of these have been highly researched so that we know that those at-risk behaviors are potential outcomes for youth who are experiencing this elevated risk in certain domains. So again, let's do an example. Let's look at the number 41 right here. So if you have a 41 on parental attitudes favorable towards drug use, the way that you would interpret that or make sure that you're able to explain that to other folks is 41% of students are at risk for problem behaviors associated with poor family management. okay? Now, what is interesting about this, and I want to also make a note here, in this situation, we have gone ahead and identified the 2 highest risk factors. I do encourage you, as you're digging deeper and you're making that meaning, you try to look at some trend data along the way and see what has been trending most quickly, right? Where has there been huge drop-offs? Where have there been huge increases? Because if we went back to Centre County's 2013 PAYS Youth Survey, we may have found that parental attitudes favorable to drug use, maybe they've decreased over time, which could be indicative of the fact that our strategic prevention efforts are having that impact that we had desired, or they may have plateaued. You may see that there's something else that you really should be focused around, or that may draw your attention, that you really want to make sure you're concentrating your efforts on. And that also goes for the perceived risk of drug use. It could be, if we went back to the 2013 PAYS report for Centre County, that had either plateaued, was on the decrease, or we may have seen that it dramatically increased since the last implementation and is worthy of attention. So I want to talk just very quickly to give you some ideas of where you can go to learn a little bit more about cut points. I know this was a very, very brief introduction to cut points, but I think it's a good foundation to not only launch your curiosity, but also to dig a little deeper with those resources we currently have available. So the first one is in your PAYS Youth Survey that you currently have. You can locate the county reports online, or you may have your at the PCCD website, or you may have your individual report near you. You can go ahead and take a look around page 90. There's a whole narrative that discusses understanding cut points. I have not gone as in depth as potentially the narrative would, or that you may need, but I'm more than happy to answer some of those questions here at the end of the session, or answer them individually. In addition to that narrative found in the youth survey, which I would advise sending your folks to that are looking at this report, I would also invite you to join the Bach-Harrison web tool and investigate the section entitled Risk and Protective Factor Information. If you're able to scroll halfway down the page, you'll see that there's an additional narrative that is very different than the one in the PAYS survey, entitled Understand Cut Points. And this gives you a little bit more of an in-depth understanding of the contributing research and how that has kind of guided the work of the cut point methodology, so that communities and other entities are enabled to make decisions using this metric. Now, the other thing for those that are a little bit more data savvy, or a little bit more interested in flexing their data muscle, Author, etc., which was the research I had briefly mentioned involving Hawkins and Catalano, the founders of Communities That Care, the developers of that model, their original publication, their journal publication, Measuring Risk and Protection in Communities Using the Communities That Care Youth Survey. This specific document, for those of you who want to dig deeper, will tell you more about that specific 2007 study that really served as the foundation and launched this effort to include cut point methodology in our PAYS to this day. So although dated 2007, some might feel that that's a bit old, but a lot of times you have to dig back and go to the historical evidence that set the groundwork or laid the framework for the measures we have now. So I do encourage you to check that out. If you have trouble accessing that because it is in fact a journal-based publication, please feel free to reach out and we can make sure that we help you with garnering that resource. Now, I won't spend too much time on this, but I did want to point out a lot of our staff here, including Erin Smith, has spent a lot of time in putting together a PAYS toolbox that includes a lot of really wonderful things, including, I just want to point out, the PAYS user guide and worksheet. Within the context of that document is a great section that asks key questions on how to analyze your risk and protective factor profiles located in your PAYS report. I encourage you to go to that user guide and worksheet and dig up those questions so that you can begin the journey of digging a little bit deeper into the analysis regarding the cut point methodology that we discussed today and some of the online Bach-Harrison tools that you were able to demo today as well. So I do encourage you to visit that site. Again, here's the graphic image for that. And also it is downloadable and also shareable. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Now, I do want to take a minute to answer your questions, and I will go back to this, but I did want to let you know that on the Epicenter website, you'll see the graphic representation in front of you. If you click on the PA Youth Survey tab, there is a Submit a Question. If you go and you're able to put in your thoughts, it will automatically be sent to us. We'll be able to garner a response and get back to you as soon as possible. This is always a really great way for us to also archive questions that come in so that we can take them to our PAYS advisory work group as we look towards the 2017 implementation. So, as many of you may be in a hurry to get other places, I do want to let you know, and then I will take your questions, that just as a reminder, please fill out the survey that will pop up once the meeting has ended. And if you'd like to be included on our mailing list, please make sure you share that information with us, as we want to get you connected with all the great things we're doing here. Now, I would love to go ahead and take a few questions if anybody has some. So far, I think I've only seen good morning greetings, which is a good start. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to pose, given what we talked about today? As we are waiting, I see a few folks are typing on my screen here. I would encourage you to go ahead and in a separate window bring up that Bach-Harrison website that we previously discussed, and go ahead and dig around into that a little bit and see what tools may be there to help you in your process. I can't tell you how much that would have been helpful in the process many years ago. I hear that a lot from veteran mobilizers and mature coalitions, that years ago they had to spend so much money hiring private evaluators and paying for software, and to now have this at their fingertips has been such an asset to what they're putting together. And not to mention, coalitions across the state have become so data savvy. The questions that people have now when we're walking through reports are so much more in depth than they were 5-10 years ago. And I think that that's truly kudos to a lot of our folks that have really just sharpened their data muscles along the way. So far, I don't see any questions popping up. We'll give it about another 60 seconds and see if anything comes to fruition. As people are typing and generating questions, I do want to point out to you, so not only will you be asked to fill in that survey, there are also 2 webinars that are going to be coming up, and I would encourage you to join. Next Friday, September 23rd, is the PAYS State Report webinar, where all the goodies of the aggregate report will be discussed and presented. In addition to that, the last of our 4-part webinar series will be on September 30th, and that's fighting the opioid epidemic through prevention. This is a very hot topic, and I encourage people to join us as we specifically address that through use of your PAYS. Now, we do have a question from one of our participants that I would like to pose. It says, is there any way to get a local school district report? If so, how much would it cost? So, Debbie, I think I need a little bit more clarification. But a lot of times it is your school superintendents who do the reports that identify the folks that are able to have access. So if you do not currently have access, I would encourage you to reach out to that school district superintendent to see if that is possible. Also, you can always make sure that you go online, and if you're interested in the county report, they are archived on the PCCD website. One of the easiest ways to get to that would be through the Google PCCD PAYS, and it will link you and provide you a link to the 2015 county reports. So that is also another thing that you can use. The school districts, there is no cost for accessing those reports, and typically if you're able to garner their data, that would not be of cost to you. There is, however, a cost to the special reports that if generated by Bach Harrison, and that is usually quite a nominal fee, but something you can negotiate, and we can send you a form to make sure that that is outlined. So thank you for that, Debbie. Now, Emily, how often does Bach Harrison set the cut points? So this I will need to dig a little deeper into, but from what I understand, that it's usually at minimum every other implementation. And so what that tells me is that these cut points for risk are very up to date and very representative of our current kind of climate of risk, nationally speaking. I have another question here regarding last week's webinar. We can be, like I said before, they will be posted if anyone had any trouble accessing those or had a conflict of interest they weren't able to attend. Those will also be posted on the website at the conclusion of our 4-part series, so please keep a lookout for that. Another question here is that it looks like that we have some people who have a report and would like to crosstabs, and who may be reaching out to Bach Harrison, and who may actually be going ahead and looking at the crosstabs online. And we have some other folks that found this incredibly helpful. So I think I'm going to check with my colleagues here. That concludes our questions that we have from the audience. And like I said, and Phyllis, thank you for your response regarding how much the special report costs. It's nominal, it's $50 for up to a 10 2-item analysis, and $5 each additional for 2-item crosstabs beyond 10. And that is only for 2015 data. And the superintendent must make that request. Thank you for that clarity, Phyllis. So I want to just remind you again, please take a moment and go ahead and fill out the survey that's going to pop up. As you guys know, I love data and I can't wait to get my hands on it. So thank you again for joining us. We look forward to talking with you next Friday, the 23rd at 11 o'clock regarding the state report. So thank you again for your time and have a great Friday.